Emperor Leopold I ruled an empire, but he was killed by his own DNA. Born with a brutal Habsburg jaw, his final days were a literal nightmare of suffocation. Unable to close his mouth or clear his lungs, the most powerful man on earth slowly drowned in his own body. The nightmare of Leopold I did not begin with his birth. It began centuries earlier, in the laboratory of his ancestors. The House of Habsburg had a famous motto, Bella Gerant Ali, tu felix Austria nubi, let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. It was a brilliant political strategy. While other kings exhausted their treasuries fighting for scraps of land, the Habsburgs simply married the heiresses of Europe. Through the altar, they acquired the Netherlands, Spain, Bohemia, Hungary, and the New World. But this accumulation of power came with a terrifying stipulation. To keep these vast territories from being split up through inheritance, the Habsburgs decided they could only marry each other. The logic was mathematical and cold. If a Habsburg married a stranger, the land might drift away. If a Habsburg married a Habsburg, the empire remained whole. By the mid-17th century, this policy had transformed from a strategy into a biological catastrophe. The family tree of Leopold I does not look like a tree. It looks like a tangled net. His parents were first cousins. His grandparents were cousins. The genetic diversity required for a healthy human being had been systematically bred out of the line. Modern geneticists calculate the coefficient of inbreeding, a number that indicates how closely related an individual's parents are. For a child of two unrelated parents, the number is near zero. For a child of a brother and sister, it is 0.25. Leopold I approached that lethal number. He was the product of generations of genetic redundancy. The DNA that built his body was a corrupted script, repeating the same errors over and over again until the errors became the dominant feature. The result was mandibular prognathism, a condition where the lower jaw grows excessively while the upper jaw, the maxilla, remains underdeveloped. In the Habsburg line, this trait was dominant. It appeared in portraits as a distinctive heavy chin or a protruding lip. But nature is cruel, and genetics is a game of Russian roulette. For some, it was merely an unsightly feature. For Leopold, the cylinder was fully loaded. When he was born on June 9, 1640, in Vienna, the silence in the birthing chamber must have been palpable. The infant archduke was small, frail, and undeniably deformed. Contemporary sources, usually so sycophantic to royalty, struggled to describe the infant Leopold without causing offense. They used words like melancholy or distinctive, but later studies in the merciless honesty of foreign envoys confirmed the severity. Leopold possessed one of the most extreme cases of the deformity in the Austrian line, rivaled only by his distant doomed cousin Charles II of Spain. His lower jaw did not just jut forward, it unhinged the aesthetic and functional architecture of his face. The lower teeth were positioned inches in front of the upper teeth, a severe class 3 malocclusion. But it was not just the bone. The soft tissue was equally affected. His lower lip was thick, fleshy, and averted, hanging slack and open, unable to meet the upper lip. Growing up with this reality was a silent daily torture. The mouth is the primary instrument of human connection. It is how we feed, how we smile, how we speak, how we kiss. For young Leopold, the mouth was a broken instrument. From infancy, he could not nurse properly. As he grew, the simple act of closing his mouth was anatomically impossible. He lived with his mouth perpetually open, a gaping wound in the center of his face. This was not just a cosmetic tragedy, it was a functional disaster. Because his lips could not form a seal, He could not retain saliva. He suffered from chronic sialorrhea, constant, uncontrollable drooling. He was a bright child, possessed of a sharp, inquisitive mind and a sensitive soul. He learned quickly, he understood languages, and he had a profound love for music. But his body betrayed his intellect at every turn. He was acutely aware of his appearance. He saw the way courtiers would avert their eyes when they spoke to him. He saw the flinching of ambassadors when they were first introduced to the young archduke. He knew with the crushing certainty of childhood that he was repulsive. The psychological toll of this cannot be overstated. To be a prince is to be looked at. To be Leopold was to wish for invisibility. Fate, however, had initially offered him a mercy. Leopold was not the eldest son. He was the spare. The heir to the throne was his older brother, Ferdinand IV, a young man who, while still possessing the Habsburg features, was robust, charismatic, and seemingly healthy. Leopold was destined for the church. The priesthood was the traditional dumping ground for the younger, weaker, or less viable sons of the dynasty. In the shadows of a cathedral, amidst the incense and the Gregorian chants, Leopold's deformity might have been hidden. He could have lived a life of the mind, buried in books and theology, shielded from the cruel glare of the public eye. He was prepared for this life. He was pious, solemn, and intellectual. He seemed ready to vanish into the clergy, a footnote in the history of his house. But the curse of the Habsburgs was not just in the jaw, it was in the vitality of the line itself. The inbreeding that deformed their faces also ravaged their immune systems. In 1654, the unthinkable happened. Ferdinand IV, the golden hope of the dynasty, died suddenly of smallpox. The candle of the heir was snuffed out, and the darkness fell upon the spare. The 14-year-old Leopold, the boy who wiped his chin with a handkerchief and hid in the corners of the palace, was suddenly dragged into the blinding light. He was now the king of the Romans, the king of Hungary, the king of Bohemia, and the heir to the Holy Roman Empire. The defense of Christendom rested on his frail shoulders. The transition was traumatic. The boy who wanted to be a priest was forced to become a god-king. When he was elected Holy Roman Emperor in 1658 at the age of 18, the coronation was a spectacle of magnificence. He wore robes heavy with gold and ermine. He held the scepter and the orb, but the crown looked too large for his head. The grandeur of the office only served to highlight the pitiable state of the man inhabiting it. The descriptions from this period are heartbreaking in their brutal honesty. A Venetian ambassador wrote that the emperor was short of stature, swarthy of complexion, and ugly of face. The description went on to detail the hanging lip and the way his mouth remained open as if he were catching flies. These were the reports sent back to the capitals of Europe. This was how his rivals, the dashing Louis XIV of France, the fierce sultans of the Ottoman Empire, saw him. They saw a weakling. They saw a man who looked like a mistake of nature. They assumed that a man with such a broken face must possess a broken will. They looked at the drooling, stammering teenager and saw an empire ripe for the taking. But Leopold was already learning the art of survival. He realized early on that he could not change his face, so he would have to change the world's perception of it, or at least control the terms of the engagement. He adopted a rigid, almost theatrical persona. He embraced the strict, stifling etiquette of the Spanish court. He began to wear black almost exclusively. He moved slowly. He spoke rarely. If he could not be admired for his beauty, he would be feared for his distance. He turned his deformity into a mask of impassive, stony silence. He became a statue before he was dead. Yet the could not stop the physical reality of his condition. As he assumed the throne, the daily torment of his existence began in earnest. The simple biological functions that every peasant in his empire performed without thinking, eating, drinking, speaking, became for Leopold a series of humiliations that occurred hour after hour, day after day. The curse of purity had placed him on the highest throne in the world, but it had also locked him in a solitary confinement of shame. The young emperor sat in his palace in Vienna, surrounded by the most beautiful art and music of the age, while his own body rotted from the genes outwards. The tragedy had only just begun. The coronation robes were packed away, the incense of the cathedral dissipated, and the young Emperor Leopold I was left alone with the crushing reality of his daily existence. To the outside world, he was the master of the Holy Roman Empire, a figure of supreme authority woven into the tapestry of divine right. But within the gilded cage of the Hofburg Palace, he was a man engaged in a ceaseless, humiliating war with his own biology. Stripping away the abstract notion of deformity reveals the brutal mechanics of living inside a skull, warped by centuries of inbreeding. For Leopold, the simple acts of being human, speaking, eating, breathing, were not unconscious reflexes. They were deliberate, exhausting, and often shameful ordeals. The torture began the moment he woke. Most of us take the structure of our faces for granted. We close our mouths to swallow, to breathe through our noses, to moisten our throats. Leopold could not. His mandibular prognathism was so severe that the lower jaw jutted forward like a shelf, pulling the lower lip with it. The upper jaw, the maxilla, was recessed and underdeveloped. This meant that the architectural seal of the mouth, the meeting of the lips, was anatomically impossible. He woke every morning with a mouth parched by the air, his throat dry and scratching. But the dryness was the lesser of two evils. The greater evil was the wetness. Because his lips hung perpetually apart, he suffered from chronic sialorrhea, the inability to retain saliva. This is a condition usually associated with infancy or severe neurological damage, not with the most powerful monarch in Christendom. The Emperor of the Romans, the defender of the faith, spent his days fighting a losing battle against his own fluids. It was a rhythmic, dripping humiliation. As he sat in the war councils, listening to generals discuss the movements of the Ottoman Turks or the French armies, Leopold would feel the familiar sickening sensation of moisture gathering at the corners of his slack mouth. He had to be hypervigilant. If he leaned forward to examine a map, gravity would betray him. This reality birthed a constant companion for the emperor, the handkerchief. In every portrait, in every description, the handkerchief is there, either in his hand or close by. It was not a fashion statement, it was a tool of survival. He became a master of the subtle gesture, a quick dab, a wipe, a turning of the head, but everyone saw it. The courtiers, bound by the rigid laws of etiquette, looked away. They studied the tapestries, they stared at their shoes, but the silence of the room screamed with the awareness of it. The psychological weight of that silence was crushing. To know that the men you command, the men who bow to you, are desperately trying not to watch you drool. It created a wall of glass between Leopold and humanity. He could see them, he could rule them, but he could never truly be one of them. He was a creature apart, leaking and broken. If silence was his shield, speech was his enemy. The human voice is a miraculous instrument, dependent on the precise collision of tongue, teeth, and lips. To form the plosive sounds, the P's and B's, you must press your lips together and release air. To form the T's and D's, your tongue must strike the back of your upper teeth. For Leopold, these mechanics were shattered. His bottom lip was too heavy and too far forward to meet the top one without immense effort. His tongue was reported to be unusually large, a common trait in the Habsburg line, making it clumsy within the cavernous, misshapen mouth. The result was a voice that did not match the man. Leopold was highly intelligent, fluent in Latin, Italian, Spanish, French, and German. His mind was a crystalline archive of history and diplomacy, but when he opened his mouth to share that intellect, the sound that came out was thick, slurred, and wet. It was the voice of a simpleton, a cruel mockery of his inner brilliance. He suffered from severe dysarthria. Every sentence was a struggle against the air. He would mumble, his words running together in a slushy cadence that forced ambassadors to lean in uncomfortably close, too close to the source of the smell, just to understand him. And so the emperor chose the only weapon left to him: silence. He became famous for his reticence. He spoke in short, clipped phrases, or often not at all. He would conduct entire audiences with nods and hand gestures. Historians have often interpreted this as the Spanish gravity, a deliberate, majestic aloofness imported from the court of Madrid. And while Leopold certainly adopted that style, it was a style born of necessity. He wrapped himself in the mystique of the distant, silent monarch because to speak was to reveal the monster. He hid his physical incompetence behind a veil of imperial mystery. It was a brilliant, tragic performance. He made his subjects believe that he was too high above them to speak, when in reality he was too ashamed. But the most visceral horror of his life was the act of eating. The banquet halls of the 17th century were theaters of power. Kings were expected to dine in public, to display their vitality and wealth. For Leopold, every meal was a public execution of his dignity. The malocclusion of his jaw was so extreme that his teeth did not meet. The upper and lower rows were like two broken gears that could not mesh. He physically could not chew. The diet of the era consisted of roasted game, heavy meats, and fibrous root vegetables. These required grinding, tearing, masticating. Leopold could do none of this. He sat at the head of the table, isolated in his grandeur, while his guests tore into their food. He was reduced to eating soft, pulpy messes, broths, mushes, eggs. When he did eat meat, he had to cut it into tiny pieces and swallow them whole, like a bird of prey. He would throw his head back and let gravity do the work that his jaw could not. It was a grotesque sight, one that he tried to hide by eating alone whenever possible. But the isolation did not save him from the consequences. The human stomach is not designed to process unchewed chunks of meat. Digestion begins in the mouth, with saliva and grinding. Leopold bypassed this step entirely. He sent whole solid masses of food directly into his stomach. The result was a lifetime of chronic agonizing dyspepsia. His gut was a fermentation chamber. The food would sit in his stomach, rotting rather than digesting, producing immense amounts of gas, bloating, and cramping. We have records of the emperor's constant complaints of abdominal pain. He was plagued by flatulence and colic. He was a man rotting from the inside out. This internal decay manifested in his breath. The combination of chronic gum disease, because his mouth was always dry and open to the air, and the fermentation in his stomach gave him a breath that was described as cadaverous. It smelled of death. The intimacy of a whisper or the closeness of a lover was tainted by the stench of one's own decaying insides. It is no wonder that Leopold was a man of few mistresses, a man who kept his distance. His body was a fortress of repulsiveness that kept the world at bay. And yet this is where the story of Leopold I transcends the genre of medical horror and touches the sublime. If his body was a dungeon, his soul found a window. That window was music. It is one of the profound ironies of history that this man, who could barely speak a coherent sentence, possessed a musical mind of genius. Leopold was not just a patron of the arts, he was a composer of genuine talent. He played the harpsichord, the violin, and the flute, but it was in composition that he found his true voice. He wrote over 150 arias, masses, and oratorios. In the evenings, when the state dinners were over, when the ambassadors had been dismissed, and the heavy doors of his private chambers were bolted shut, he would sit at the harpsichord, his dark clothes blending into the shadows. The handkerchief would be on the instrument's ledge, ready for the inevitable drip. The stomach would be churning with the pain of the evening meal. But as his fingers touched the keys, the deformity vanished. Music requires no jaw, it requires no teeth, it is pure mathematical emotion. In the complex counterpoint of the Baroque style, Leopold found a structure that was perfect, logical, and beautiful. Everything his body was not. He poured his melancholy, his frustration, and his devout faith into the notes. His music is somber, intricate, and deeply affecting. It is the sound of a man crying out from behind a wall. When he played, he was not the hogmouth, as his cruelest detractors called him. He was a creator. He was whole. This dichotomy defined his 47-year reign. He was a man living a double life. By day, he was the stiff, silent, awkward emperor, wiping his chin and hiding his pain behind a mask of indifference. By night, he was the passionate artist, weaving tapestries of sound that soared toward the heaven he believed had cursed him. He managed to separate his mind from his flesh. He treated his body like a troublesome servant, something to be ignored, managed, and endured, but never allowed to dictate the terms of his soul. But the body keeps the score. The stress of this existence, the constant pain, the chronic infection of the gums, the digestive failure, began to wear him down. He aged prematurely. His face grew gaunt, which only made the jaw jut out more aggressively, like a skeletal prow. The Habsburg jaw is often treated as a punchline in history memes, a symbol of aristocratic stupidity. But for Leopold, it was a daily grinding martyrdom. It was a test of faith. He believed that God had ordained him to rule, and therefore God had ordained this suffering. He bore it with a stoicism that is terrifying to contemplate. He did not abdicate. He did not hide in a monastery. He sat on the throne, drooling and in pain, and he did his duty. As the years ground on, however, the internal damage began to accumulate. The digestive system, assaulted for decades by unchewed food, began to weaken the rest of his constitution. The constant respiratory infections caused by the open mouth and the inability to filter air through the nose scarred his lungs. The machine was breaking down. The prison walls were closing in. And as the 18th century dawned, bringing with it new wars and new crises, the emperor's body began its final slow rebellion. The stage was being set for the final act, where the jaw would cease to be merely a burden and would become the instrument of his death. By the spring of 1705, the long twilight struggle of Leopold I had entered its final, inevitable phase. He was 64 years old, an age that, in the early 18th century, placed him among the ancients of the earth. He had sat upon the throne of the Caesars for nearly half a century, outliving his enemies, outliving his friends, and outliving the very era that had crowned him. The world outside the Hofburg Palace was changing. The geometric precision of the Enlightenment was beginning to erode the dark mysticism of the Baroque. But inside the emperor's chambers, time had stopped. The air was heavy with the scent of beeswax, old velvet, and the cloying sweet odor of decay. The man who sat in the center of this gloom was no longer the frightened boy of 14 or the silent enigma of 40, he was a ruin. The Habsburg jaw, which had defined his youth as a grotesque curiosity, had now, in his old age, become the architect of his agony. The true horror of Leopold's end lies buried beneath the generic historical accounts of dropsy. This archaic term is a veil that hides a terrifying physiological reality. In modern medical terms, the emperor was suffering from congestive heart failure. His heart, the engine of his life, was exhausted. For decades, it had pumped blood through a body racked by chronic infection, malnutrition from his inability to chew, and the ceaseless stress of ruling an empire under siege. Now the muscle was failing. It could no longer move the blood effectively against the pull of gravity. And when the pump fails, the fluids stop moving. They begin to pool. They begin to rise. The tragedy of dropsy is that it is a death by drowning, but the water comes from within. It began in his legs. The ankles swelled, turning the skin tight and shiny, weeping fluid through the pores. The imperial boots would no longer fit. Then the water rose to his abdomen, distending his belly, pressing against the stomach that had already tortured him for a lifetime with gas and fermentation. He became heavy, waterlogged, a prisoner in a body that was literally becoming a swamp. But the true horror, the horror that would link his death directly to his malformed jaw, began when the fluid reached his chest. The lungs are spongy tissues designed for the exchange of air. They require dryness to function. As Leopold's heart weakened, the blood backed up in the pulmonary veins, forcing liquid to leak into the air sacs of the lungs. This is pulmonary edema. Imagine the sensation of taking a deep breath, but instead of the clean rush of oxygen, you feel a bubbling resistance. Imagine the panic of the drowning man, the instinct to thrash and surface, but realizing that the ocean is inside your own ribcage. There's no surface to break. There's only the relentless, rising tide of your own serum. In the medical context of 1705, there was no Lasix, no diuretics to drain the fluid, no oxygen tanks to ease the burden. The physicians of the Viennese court, men in heavy robes and heavy wigs, stood around his bed with expressions of learned helplessness. Their understanding of the body was still tethered to the ancient theory of humors. They saw an imbalance of phlegm. They prescribed bloodletting, which only weakened the failing heart further, depriving it of the very volume it needed to pump. They prescribed emetics to induce vomiting, a torture for a man who could barely open his mouth without drooling, and whose esophagus was likely scarred from years of acid reflux. Every cure was a fresh assault, but the centerpiece of this tragedy was the mechanical failure of the cough. The cough reflex is the body's last line of defense against suffocation. It is a violent, explosive event designed to clear the airways. To cough effectively, the anatomy must perform a precise sequence of actions. The diaphragm contracts, the vocal cords close tightly to build up massive air pressure within the chest, and then the glottis opens suddenly to release that pressure, blasting out the mucus or fluid, blocking the windpipe. Crucially, the mouth usually closes to help modulate this pressure and direct the force. Leopold I could not close his mouth. The class 3 malocclusion that had shamed him in the banquet halls now threatened to kill him in his bed. His lower jaw jutted out so far, and his lower lip hung so slack that forming a seal was anatomically impossible. He could not build the necessary back pressure. When the fluid rose in his throat, triggering the desperate primal urge to cough, he would heave. His chest would spasm, but the explosion never came. Instead of a sharp, clearing cough, there was only a wet, ineffective wheeze. The air rushed out of his gaping mouth without force, carrying with it a spray of saliva and foam, but leaving the heavy, suffocating fluid deep in his lungs. The sound of this struggle was the soundtrack of the Hofburg in April and May of 1705. It was a gurgling, rattling sound, the death rattle, but it lasted for weeks. The courtiers who stood vigil outside his door could hear it, the sound of a man trying to bail out a sinking ship with a sieve. Inside the room, the emperor was propped up on high pillows. He could not lie flat. If he laid his head down, gravity would distribute the fluid across the entire surface of his lungs, and he would suffocate instantly. He had to sleep sitting up, nodding off in brief, exhausted snatches, only to wake up gasping, his eyes wide with the terror of air hunger. The isolation of these final weeks was profound. Leopold had spent his life building walls to hide his deformity. He had used etiquette, distance, and silence to protect his dignity. Now the walls were crumbling. The biology he had suppressed was screaming. He could no longer hide the drool. It mixed with the bloody sputum bubbling from his lungs, staining the silk sheets, staining the black robes he insisted on wearing. The handkerchiefs were useless now. The flow was too great. The attendants had to wipe his face constantly, an intimacy that must have felt like a violation to a man who had treated his body as a shameful secret. Yet, even at the edge of this abyss, the emperor's mind remained lucid, which was perhaps the cruelest aspect of all. He was not delirious. He knew exactly what was happening. He was a deeply religious man, a Habsburg who believed that his suffering was a test from God, a purgatory on earth to cleanse his soul before the final judgment. He did not rage, he did not scream. He bore the sensation of drowning with the same stoic silence that he had borne the stares of the ambassadors. He continued to give orders. He continued to listen to the reports from the front lines of the War of the Spanish Succession. He was winning the war against France, but he was losing the war against his own fluids. The connection between his jaw and his death became undeniable in these moments. A man with a normal jaw might have cleared his throat. A man with a normal jaw might have bought himself a few more months of life. But the genetic legacy of his ancestors, the purity they had fought so hard to preserve, had constructed a trap. The bone structure that marked him as a Habsburg was now the bar across the door, preventing the air from entering, preventing the fluid from leaving. The dynasty had bred a king who was designed to rule but not designed to survive. As May began, the swelling in his legs became so severe that the skin began to weep openly. The pressure on his heart was immense. The dropsy had become anasarca, total body swelling. He was unrecognizable. The thin, swarthy face was puffy and gray. The eyes, usually so sharp and melancholy, were buried in swollen flesh, but the jaw remained. The jaw was the skeletal anchor, the immutable fact. It jutted out from the swollen ruin of his face, open, slack, and defeated. The mouth that had never closed in life would not close in death. He spent his final days clutching a crucifix, his breath coming in shallow, bubbling rasps. The priests were constantly by his side, chanting the prayers for the dying, the Latin words hanging in the thick air. Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy. But nature has no mercy. Genetics has no theology. It is a blind mathematical force. It had calculated the dimensions of Leopold's skull centuries before he was born, and now it was simply balancing the equation. The courtiers watched with a mixture of pity and horror. They were witnessing the fall of an icon, but they were also witnessing something more primal, the revolt of the body against the crown. All the gold in Vienna, all the armies in Europe, could not force the emperor's lips to close. They could not force his diaphragm to clear his lungs. The most powerful man in the world was being killed by the shape of his own chin. The nights were the worst. In the darkness, The sense of suffocation grew. The shadows of the bed curtains looked like closing water. Leopold would grip the arms of his chair, his knuckles white, fighting for every single cubic inch of air. He was drowning on dry land, in the middle of a palace, surrounded by servants who would have died for him, but could not breathe for him. The edge of the abyss was not a metaphor. It was a physical reality, a cliff edge of oxygen starvation that he walked every minute of every hour. And as the sun rose on the 5th of May, 1705, the tired heart finally began to falter. Unable to push the heavy, water-laden blood one beat further, the abyss opened up to swallow him whole. Before the crypt door closes on Leopold I, a persistent historical lie must be confronted. For centuries, history books, written largely by his enemies in France or by historians obsessed with the glamour of the Sun King, Louis XIV, have painted Leopold as a caricature. They describe him as the hogmouth, a vacillating, weak-willed creature who hid in the shadows of the Hofburg while his generals won his wars. They look at the portraits of that hanging jaw and the gaping mouth, and they assume that the deformity of the face reflected a deformity of the spirit. They assume that because he looked like a monster, he must have thought like a simpleton. This is not just a misconception. It is a slander that ignores the most profound aspect of his existence. If we look strictly at the medical reality we have just explored, the chronic pain, the malnutrition, the sleep deprivation, the constant humiliation of the drool, we are left with a startling question: how did he function at all? Most men born into such a prison of flesh would have crumbled. They would have retreated into hedonism, madness, or total seclusion. They would have abdicated the heavy burden of the crown to a regent. Leopold did none of these things. He ruled. He ruled for 47 years, longer than almost any other monarch in European history. And he did not just occupy the throne, he transformed it. The twist in the story of Leopold I is that his physical weakness was the forge of his psychological iron. He knew from the age of 14 that he could never be the warrior king his ancestors were. He could not lead a cavalry charge. His constitution was too frail. He could not command a battlefield with a booming voice. His jaw rendered his speech slurred and quiet. He could not dazzle the court with his beauty. He was repulsive. So Leopold invented a new kind of kingship. He became the first bureaucrat king. If his body was his enemy, his mind would be his weapon. While his rival, Louis XIV, spent his days dancing in ballets and hunting in the forests of Versailles, projecting an image of effortless physical perfection, Leopold was at his desk. He worked 12, sometimes 14 hours a day. He read every dispatch, every treaty, every spy report. He possessed a memory that terrified his ministers. He could recall the minutiae of a negotiation from 20 years prior. He understood that in a world of chaotic violence, the man who controls the paperwork controls the outcome. He turned the Hofburg into a machine of administration. He defeated the Ottoman Empire not with a sword, but with logistics. He built the Grand Alliance against France not with charisma, but with patience. The sheer willpower required to maintain this discipline was staggering. Sitting at a desk for 10 hours while your stomach cramps from indigestion, while your gums bleed, while you have to pause every few minutes to wipe the saliva from your chin. To do this day after day, decade after decade, requires a stoicism that borders on the superhuman. He treated his body with a cold, detached indifference. He compartmentalized his suffering. The pain belonged to the animal part of him. The duty belonged to the imperial part. He refused to let the animal dictate terms to the emperor. This reframes his famous silence. The court whispered that he was slow-witted, because he took so long to answer questions. In reality, he was deliberate. He knew that his speech was garbled, so he made sure that when he did speak, the words were unassailable. He weaponized his deformity. He used the Spanish etiquette, the rigid, slow-moving ceremonial style of the court, as a shield. By forcing ambassadors to navigate layers of protocol before they could even see him, he turned his physical isolation into political mystique. He made himself an icon, a distant, unreadable statue. He knew that if he let people get too close, they would smell the decay, so he made himself a god who lived in the dark. In this light, Leopold ceases to be a victim of inbreeding and becomes its conqueror. He was playing a hand of cards that should have guaranteed failure: a broken body, a bankrupt treasury, enemies on all sides. And he won. He saved Europe from the Turks. He checked the ambition of France. He secured his dynasty. He did all of this while trapped in a body that was actively trying to kill him. The hogmouth was in truth a titan of pure will, but the body, in the end, demands its due. In the immediate aftermath of May 5th, 1705, the struggle for breath ceased. The emperor was dead. The silence in the bedchamber was no longer the silence of etiquette, but the final silence of the grave. And almost immediately, the machinery of the Habsburg death ritual began to turn. This ritual, macabre to modern sensibilities, serves as the final poetic confirmation of the tragedy of his flesh. The Habsburgs did not believe in leaving the body intact. They believed in a tripartite burial, a tradition that separated the components of the monarch to maximize the spread of their sanctity. But for Leopold, this separation feels less like a religious honor and more like a final autopsy of his suffering. Within hours of his death, the court surgeons arrived. These were the men who had failed to cure him in life. Now their knives would reveal the secrets of his death. They opened the chest that had heaved so desperately for air. They removed the heart, the muscle that had finally collapsed under the weight of the fluid. The heart was placed in a silver urn. It would not stay with his body. It was taken to the Augustinerkirche, the church of the Augustinian friars, to be placed in the Herzgruft. There, it would rest among the hearts of his ancestors, a collection of silver jars in a dark chapel. Then came the abdomen. The surgeons cut into the stomach that had been the source of his lifelong misery. They removed the intestines, the liver, the organs that had been tortured by his inability to chew. These viscera were placed in a copper urn. They were taken to the catacombs beneath St. Stephen's Cathedral, the ducal crypt. Finally, what remained, the shell, the bones, the muscle, and the face, was prepared for the Kaisergruft, the imperial crypt. The body was embalmed, wrapped in silk, and placed in a wooden coffin, which was then sealed inside a massive, ornate sarcophagus made of lead and tin. The sarcophagus of Leopold I is a masterpiece of Baroque art. It is decorated with skulls wearing crowns, weeping angels, and heavy drapery sculpted from metal. It is dark, imposing, and magnificent. But there is a detail on the sarcophagus that chills the blood. The sculptors, in their desire to honor the emperor, created a realistic effigy of him on the lid, and they did not lie. The effigy clearly shows the Habsburg jaw. Even in lead, even in the glorification of death, the deformity is there. The protruding chin, the heavy lip, it is immortalized in metal, a permanent reminder that this was the defining feature of his existence. He could not escape it, not in life, not in death, and not in art. The funeral procession was a somber affair, winding through the streets of Vienna. The city was in mourning, but there was also a palpable sense of relief. The court had been holding its breath along with the emperor for weeks. Now, the tension broke. The old man was gone. The era of black clothes and silence was over. His son Joseph I was waiting in the wings. Joseph was different. He was young, he was vigorous, and while he carried the Habsburg lip, it was mild. He could close his mouth, he could smile. He represented a new hope, a genetic reprieve. But as the heavy doors of the Capuchin crypt slammed shut on Leopold's lead coffin, sealing him into the darkness he had always inhabited, the story was far from over. The genetic die that had been cast centuries ago had not finished its rolling. Leopold was the nadir of the Austrian line, the lowest point of physical degradation in Vienna. But he was a genius compared to what was happening in the other branch of the family. While Vienna buried its stoic, suffering emperor, eyes turned west, toward Madrid. The Habsburgs ruled Spain as well, and the two branches had been intermarrying for generations to keep the circle closed. Leopold's parents were cousins, but the King of Spain, Charles II, was the product of an even tighter, more catastrophic loop. Leopold's death signaled the beginning of the end for the House of Habsburg as a unified global force. He had held it together through sheer grit, but the biology was crumbling. The purity of the blood was turning into poison. The jaw was just the visible symptom of a rot that went down to the chromosomal level. Leopold had managed to survive it. He had managed to wrestle a functioning life out of a broken body. He was the exception. The rule was about to be demonstrated in Spain. As the candles burned low around Leopold's fresh tomb, the whispers began. The Austrian line had survived barely. But the Spanish line? The Spanish line was walking into a nightmare that made Leopold's suffering look like a mercy. Leopold had been a prisoner of his jaw, but he had kept his mind. His cousin in Spain had lost everything. Leopold I was left resting in pieces across the city of Vienna, his heart in silver, his guts in copper, his jaw in lead. He was a man who drowned in the air, a king who ruled from the shadows, a musician who sang without a voice. He was the triumph of the soul over the cell, but he was also a warning that nature cannot be mocked and that the pursuit of a pure bloodline is a path that leads only to the grave. The grave is closed. The silence of Leopold is final. But from the west, a terrifying sound is rising. It is not the sound of a genius trapped in a broken body. It is the sound of a body with no mind at all. The heavy lead lid of the sarcophagus in the Capuchin crypt did not just seal away a body, it sealed away an era. With Leopold I's death, the 17th century, a time of witch trials, plague, and religious absolutism, truly ended for Austria. But as the incense smoke cleared and the court shed its black mourning robes, a disturbing realization began to settle over the dynasty. They had buried the man, but they had not buried the problem. The Habsburg jaw was not merely a personal affliction of the late emperor. It was a brand burnt into the very genetic code of the family, a recurring nightmare that no amount of prayer or imperial decree could banish. The immediate aftermath of Leopold's death offers a fascinating brief window of false hope. His successor was his eldest son, Joseph I. When Joseph stepped onto the balcony to address the crowds, the contrast was blinding. Where Leopold had been small, dark, and misshapen, Joseph was tall, blond, and handsome. He was called the Sun King of the East. He possessed a vitality that his father never had. He loved hunting, he loved women, and he moved with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin. The court let out a collective sigh of relief. It seemed as though the curse had been broken, that the genetic coin flip had finally landed on the side of health. But if you looked closely at Joseph, and the portrait painters of the time were careful to minimize this, the mark was still there. Joseph had the lip. It was subtler, less ruinous than his father's, but the telltale protrusion of the lower jaw remained. He could close his mouth, yes, but the architecture was unmistakably Habsburg. The poison was not gone, it was merely diluted. And the tragedy of the Habsburgs is that even when they produced a healthy heir, the fragility of the line lay in wait. Joseph I, the Golden Hope, would rule for only 6 years before dying of smallpox at the age of 32. The biological resilience of the family was shot. They were a house of cards, where even the strongest cards were brittle. This reveals the ultimate meaning of Leopold's suffering. His life serves as the most brutal lesson in the history of genetics. The Habsburgs believed that their blood was a divine substance, a blue fluid that elevated them above the laws of nature. They believed that by marrying only within their own kin, they were distilling this divinity, concentrating the essence of kingship. They were wrong. Nature abhors uniformity. Biology thrives on chaos, on the mixing of differences. By closing the circle, the Habsburgs were not purifying their blood, they were stagnating it. Leopold I was the human embodiment of this stagnation. Every moment of pain he suffered, the cramps in his gut, the dryness in his throat, the shame in his mind, was a receipt presented by nature for the arrogance of his ancestors. He paid the bill for 2 centuries of incest. And the tragedy is that he paid it with such quiet dignity. He was a man who should have been a warning sign, a living billboard screaming stop to the marriage brokers of Europe. Instead, because he was effective, because he won wars and wrote music, the family learned nothing. They looked at his survival not as a lucky escape, but as proof that the system worked. See, they reasoned, even with the jaw, he was a great emperor. The blood holds true. This delusion set the stage for a horror that would eclipse Leopold entirely. The story of the Austrian emperor remains incomplete without looking to the west, to the other branch of the family tree that was rotting in the Spanish sun. Leopold I is often cited as the victim of the Habsburg jaw. But in the grand scope of medical history, Leopold was the lucky one. He retained his mind. He retained his fertility. He lived to 64. He was capable of love, of art, of strategy. He was a prisoner in his body, but the prisoner was awake and intelligent. Compare this to his cousin, Charles II of Spain, who was alive at the same time, suffering from the same genetic policy, but with a ferocity that defies belief. If Leopold was a tragedy, Charles was a horror story. In Charles, the jaw was so deformed that he could not chew at all. His tongue was so massive he could barely speak. But unlike Leopold, the damage was not just physical. The inbreeding had assaulted the brain. Charles was mentally disabled, prone to fits of madness, unable to understand the world around him. He was called El Hechizado, the bewitched, because the people could not believe that simple biology could create such a creature. They thought it must be witchcraft. Leopold's life takes on a new poignant light when placed next to Charles's. Leopold was the stoic hero of the narrative, the man who overcame his biology. Charles was the victim who was crushed by it. Leopold proved that the human spirit could survive the Habsburg curse. Charles proved that the curse eventually wins. Standing before the lead sarcophagus of Leopold I requires according him a respect that was denied to him in life. The caricature of the hogmouth must be stripped away to see the man beneath. Forgetting the drool and the silence reveals the survivor. He was a survivor of a biological experiment conducted by his own family. He was a ruler who took a broken instrument and played a symphony. He was a father who tried to protect his children from the same fate, even as he arranged their marriages with the same fatal logic. The story of Leopold I is not just a story about a jaw, It is a story about the limits of power. You can command armies. You can build palaces of gold. You can claim to be God's shadow on earth, but you cannot command your own DNA. You cannot bribe a chromosome. In the end, the emperor of the world was just a man, fighting for air, humbled by the bone in his own face. The crypt is cold. The lead coffin is sealed. The heart in the silver urn has long since turned to dust. But the lesson remains. We live in an age where we think we can control everything: our environment, our bodies, our genes. Leopold stands as a sentinel from the past, his jutting jaw a grim reminder that there are forces older and stronger than human ambition. He endured his prison of flesh with grace, but he died in it all the same. And as the darkness of the 18th century deepens, the focus shifts. The Austrian line has buried its dead. But in Madrid, the final act is playing out. The King of Spain is dying. He is childless, hairless, senile at 35. And his death will not just end a life, it will trigger a world war and collapse the greatest empire on earth. Leopold was the twilight of the Habsburgs. Charles II will be the midnight. But in Madrid, the final act is playing out. In the court of the bewitched, the nightmare becomes absolute. The coffin opens on a man who is barely human, revealing the face of genetic annihilation.